In an increasingly divided and multipolar world, how is NATO adapting? As day one of the Ankara summit wraps, we'll look at the formidable challenges facing the West's premier defense alliance, from formulating a collective approach to Russia to the commitment issues of its biggest member, plus dealing with the globally destabilizing conflicts of the Middle East. How should NATO respond? I'm Andrea Sankey, and on this special edition of the Newsmakers, I'll be joined by my panel of experts here in Ankara at the NATO summit.
Every NATO summit is shaped by the crises of its time. In Ankara, leaders gather as Russia's war in Ukraine drags on, and the conflict with Iran expands the alliance's focus beyond its eastern flank. On top of this, Washington is urging Europe to take greater responsibility for its own defense. Together, it presents the Ankara NATO summit with perhaps its most demanding agenda in years. For many European leaders, the immediate priority is preserving transatlantic unity. Months of disagreements over Iran and US President Donald Trump's repeated calls for greater burden sharing have shifted the focus beyond defense spending alone.
We weren't treated well because we did something in Iran. We don't need anybody's help. I didn't even want their help, but before I asked, they said they wouldn't be there.
Allies are now under pressure to prove they can translate political commitments into military capability.
For the European officials, the European leaders who are coming here, the main idea is to set aside tension with Donald Trump, particularly over the war in Iran, and show that they are taking on more of the burden for Europe's security. So that's what they want this summit to be about. Last year they pledged to have a big increase in defence spending, and this year they want to show that they're stepping up, that spending is happening.
That is why defence production has become a central focus of the summit. NATO wants allies to replenish depleted stockpiles, expand industrial capacity, and deliver weapons more quickly, as Europe prepares to assume a greater role in its own security. The urgency is driven largely by Ukraine. More than 4 years after Russia's full-scale invasion, NATO continues to view Moscow as its primary long-term threat, arguing that sustained support for Kiev remains central to Europe's security.
As Ukraine continues to defend its sovereignty, allies and NATO partners must continue to ensure Ukraine gets what it needs. And let me be clear, all allies need to pull their weight, so that our support to Ukraine continues to flow. Because Ukraine's security is so closely linked with our own.
But Ukraine no longer defines the alliance's agenda on its own. The recent US-Israeli war on Iran has reinforced concerns over air and missile defense, while renewing attention on NATO's southern flank, where Turkey's position between the Black Sea and the Middle East has taken on added strategic importance. If every NATO summit reflects the strategic realities of the moment, Ankara offers a glimpse of what may define the next. An alliance no longer confronting one dominant threat, but several competing ones at the same time.
Well, joining me now here in Ankara to look further at those competing threats, as well as what some call the existential challenges facing NATO, are Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for the New York Times, Stephen Erlanger, Distinguished Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Ian Lesser, and Military and Diplomatic Analyst, Alexandru Hudisteanu. Thanks all so much for being with me. I think we need to start with the biggest visual from today, which was the arrival of President Donald Trump, who came, as he said, only out of real respect for President Erdogan. So, Stephen, we still have NATO and NATO's biggest military and its founding member previously threatening to take territory off a fellow NATO member and saying he still will, as well as refusing to really present Russia as a threat to NATO itself, and then saying that both NATO and the EU didn't have its allies back when Trump declared war on Iran. So how should NATO members actually deal with the United States, and is there a collective approach here?
Well, the collective approach is to get through this summit with as little fuss as possible. The problem is, if you have Trump at a summit without drama, it's like a day without sunshine. Trump enjoys the drama, and he enjoys lording it over people, and he likes the power of it, and he likes the glitter and the gloss. And I think Trump has undermined NATO credibility in the ways you've just mentioned. There's no question. He has undermined the sense among allies that America is being somehow more friendly to its adversaries than to its allies. He's demanding loyalty of sovereign nations. At the same time, Trump has recommitted to collective defense. He's recommitted to the nuclear umbrella. He still gives Ukraine quite a lot of crucial intelligence information. He has had long talks with Putin, but he's also learned to have an admiration for Zelensky also. So, I mean, it's easy to caricature Trump because Trump does it to himself, but so far, so good, I think.
Okay. Ian, would you agree there? Because even having said all that, things can change easily from 1 minute to the next.
Well, look, I would agree with that. I mean, I think, what the difference is that in years past, these used to be fairly predictable occasions. They were scripted. You sort of knew what was going to come out. And as you said in your introduction, actually, there are some existential threats. There's a war in Europe. There is lack of clarity about what the United States is going to, the nature of the American presence in Europe, security presence in the future. There are all kinds of risks the alliance faces, but they're at base, some of the really existential problems are political ones. There's a big crisis of trust across the Atlantic. It exists in the security space, it exists in the trade space, it exists on technology and other issues. And so it's harder to have those kinds of constructive conversations when you have that lack of trust and a lack of predictability, if I could end on that. I think, Europe above all, European allies want predictability from Washington. And it's been in short supply recently. And that makes it all very much more difficult. But I do think it really makes a difference that there is apparently this rapport between President Trump and President Erdogan. He wants to see this be a success. And I think that makes a difference. But we'll see.
Yeah. But on that rapport, we just had President Trump reiterate today that he wants Turkey to get the F-35s that they've more or less paid for. Does that rearrange or reset the NATO alliance in a way?
I don't think it's critical to the NATO debate on the issues that are on the agenda. I think it makes a big difference in U.S.-Turkish relations, obviously. But mind you, it's not so easy for the president to promise this because Turkey was thrown out of the F-35 program some years ago after it brought a Russian air defense system. That's really a congressional action. And in order to reverse it, you need to convince Congress to take these sanctions off. Now, he may be able to do that, but it's not a straightforward thing. It was also a matter of co-production. Turkey had a business stake in this, and those pieces have been given away long ago. So perhaps they could buy it. Anyway, there's a lot of symbolism in it, and if I think the president can, sort of say that he's got his best efforts to get Turkey out of the sanction package, that makes a big difference in terms of the relationship here.
Yeah. Alexandru, go ahead, especially on the defense issues.
So I think we should also look at the other side of the story, because obviously President Trump represents the executive power of US, and in that sense it has some avenues of work, but NATO's commitment or US commitment to NATO is more on the side of the Congress, and we see constantly that the Congress is voting for commitments to NATO, voting for support of Ukraine, voting for some form of continuity and some form of predictability. But at the same time, Trump likes, and he's a businessman, and he likes to portray himself as a businessman even in politics. So he likes unpredictability because that gives, in essence, edge in business. And he looks at everything around him in a transactional manner and behaves in a transactional manner also with the allies in Europe. To some extent, maybe it's a wake-up call. And I will dare to maybe draw a parallel to the 1990s moment where NATO was again to a crisis of identity, which was a lack of threats back then. Now we have a lot of threats on the NATO's periphery and even inside, so it's not a lack of threats that changes now this perspective. It's more like a realignment of commitments, which Trump President Trump tries to push it in a more forceful way rather than wait for the Europeans to wake up. So to that extent, I don't think US is necessarily backing out of NATO. It's more like reassessing its commitments, especially because there are other commitments in other theaters. And it looks sometimes that President Trump finds out that NATO cannot be everywhere, because again, NATO is a defensive alliance with a very clear geography and a very clear mandate. They cannot just join a war of action that President Trump started somewhere around the world.
Okay. Stephen, you look to be on the same.
Well, just let's be fair. I mean, Americans have been asking Europeans to pay more for their own defense since Harry Truman. Bob Gates warned Europeans that eventually the mood would turn in the United States if it felt that it was funding Europe's lovely life. And Trump has made that real. And I think Trump understands that being difficult has helped Rutte and others to get Europeans to agree to pay more. Now the question is the money real, and who has the money? The Brits are having trouble, the French are having trouble, the Germans have money, which makes everybody else nervous. But there is a tremendous change, I think it is fair to say, helped by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really shook people, particularly in Germany, let alone on the eastern flank. So I think NATO does understand it's in a serious moment. And I think, as Ian said, the main understanding is, yes, the US has other priorities, but let's manage this process. Let's make sure that American capabilities, as they're withdrawn, do not leave vulnerabilities. And let's keep pushing, keep kicking the Europeans to do what they've promised to do. This is something Trump's actually quite good at.
It's interesting, Ian, because on the topic of greater defense spending, there's a very obvious presence of defense manufacturers here at this conference in NATO, and at this conference for NATO. And it's interesting because I was recently speaking to an analyst on defense spending who said it doesn't act as a deterrent. When countries have more weapons, he said, when you buy a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So now we have this kind of changing theme of NATO, not so much as a defense organization, but is it being seen more, with the presence of so much defense manufacturers here, an offensive organization, or no?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I think what is happening, first of all, it's not new that there should be, defense industry presence at these summits and on the margins of them. That's a traditional thing. What has changed, though, is that it's not just that there is a war going on in Europe, that there's an enormous amount of new spending, which is fueling this new relationship between manufacturers, providers of defense goods and services, and governments. But it's also that the whole debate about technology and what you buy with all this money is changing. It used to be that you would come to these summits and yes, there were defense industry exhibits and things like that. It was all about very conventional stuff. Airplanes, submarines, tanks. Now it's all about things going on in cyberspace and drones and autonomous systems and all kinds of things that are very non-traditional. So a lot of things are changing at once. I mean, it's the threat environment, but it's also the technology debate. A lot of money is going to be spent. There's going to be a much more European NATO, not just in that sense, but in other respects. But what are you buying? What is the right thing, and how do you buy it? And that's not an easy equation. So I think that's part of what's on display.
Okay, Alexandru, do you feel that the increasing presence of defense manufacturers and the increase, obviously, in spending after so many decades of the United States pushing for it, is it changing at all the very identity of NATO as a defense organization?
I don't think so, because there are two aspects here. First of all, I would like to say that I think the more existential threat is exactly NATO's ability to pace with change, because NATO is a learning organization and has been through many steps of change across the year. We're talking 8 strategic concepts in its history, but with a variance of about 10 to 15 years. Now we're 4 years in the new strategic concept, and we kind of feel that it's probably a little already past, at least the history around already kind of pushed forward than what people were expecting back in 2022. So I think the existential part here is, will NATO be able to keep up with the change, with the pace of change, which has accelerated, as Ian was saying. And no, spending money on defense doesn't necessarily make NATO an offensive alliance, because maybe there is a small misconception here. Nations don't spend money for NATO assets. They spend money on their own assets, which combine offensive and defensive capabilities.
Okay.
What NATO is doing, it's managing generally and coordinating alliance level actions, which are by definition defensive, because that's NATO's mandate. So obviously you spend on military hardware, which by definition is an offensive tool, but it's about how you use that offensive tool rather than its let's say label.
Yeah. Interesting to think of Russia's perspective on that, though, you know, which many NATO members obviously see as the one key threat to the alliance itself. But I'd like to go back, Stephen, with a little more context. Alexandru alluded to, you know, memories of a few decades past in some certain NATO conferences. Have you ever seen a conference really like this, whereby the, you know, again, the biggest, a founding member, is also the most divisive player in the alliance itself?
It's been trending that way. The Hague last year felt very similar. They had pacified or appeased Trump with the 5% of national income pledge, but when Rutte wanted that pledge by 2029, they refused. So it's 2035, which implies there's going to be kind of defense spending going up at the end. So I do think when people talk about a transformed NATO, a NATO 3.0, this is the serious aspect of this, because it's partly the psychological understanding of the Europeans that NATO won't be the same, that they really must do more for their own interests, and they must coordinate more, and they must figure out a way to do it through NATO, because NATO is bigger than the European Union, and the European Union is not really a defensive project, it's a peace project. And they have to figure out ways to coordinate defense industry, NATO capability requirements, do they buy European or buy American? And if you're afraid of the Russian invading in 2029, what's the cheapest, what's the fastest? These are very serious issues. And yet at the same time, underneath it, there is this strange undercurrent of, you know, what is Trump thinking? Trump just recently, today, in his meeting after meeting Erdogan, you know, talked about how disappointed he was in allies because they weren't for the United States in the war against Iran, though he never asked them to help in advance. And he's been calling NATO a paper tiger. And, you know, this does make you worry. At the same time, the draft communique is very clear. It's a reassertment of collective defense, of Article 5, of support for Ukraine. So I think people can take some reassurance from that. But Trump is an increasingly unpredictable factor. But as his power begins to wane, and it is domestically, I think we can get through this, and maybe next year we won't bother to have a NATO summit at all.
At all. Ian, would you see that on the cards, to actually just scrap the NATO summit, because in the back of their minds, the fellow members are thinking, you know, we've been an institution for 77 years. We've got a few more years of this president, and we're going to exist while he should be out of office, and we won't have to deal with him anymore. Do you think that's
well,
playing?
Look,
Go ahead.
I mean, I'm American, but I sit in Brussels. And whether you're talking to EU circles or NATO circles, there is this discussion about, you know, based on exactly the things we've been talking about, you know, what are they seeing in America? Is this just a Trump inclination? Is it unique to this administration, or is it something structural, something bigger, that the United States has simply gone off in a different direction, will not be the same kind of ally anymore if you're talking about security or trade or other things? And so it's unclear. I think there is a kind of hopefulness, in a sense, that that this can be managed, and then, you know, in another after the U.S. midterm elections, maybe looking 3 years out, things will be different. But there are some things that are structural. I mean, clearly, as we were saying, there are competing strategic priorities in Asia. It's well understood that the United States, over time, is going to be focusing more and more on China as a peer competitor, potential peer competitor, and other things. And so Europe needs to prepare for a NATO that's going to be much more European. And I think that's probably what's coming. But where is the floor there? You can't just have, for example, a NATO that is almost entirely about Europe in conventional defense and still wants to rely on the American strategic nuclear umbrella from across the Atlantic. You always needed that tripwire of Americans here in Europe to make the deterrent credible. That kind of thing hasn't had a serious discussion since the Cold War years. But we're coming back to issues like that. If you allow me to just mention one other thing, it's not just about where Europe spends on defense. There is a gap in terms of strategic culture, the attitudes towards war. I mean, you see that on display over Iran, for example. But even in different geography in Europe with regard to Russia and the Ukraine war, it's one thing to spend money. It's another thing to put people in harm's way. And for very good historical reasons, there's a lot of reticence about that in Europe.
And you bring up Iran. It is divisive, obviously a divisive issue, but it firmly pits all of its NATO allies against the United States. And it does bring back some memories of the war in Iraq. Okay, there were some NATO members on board. They survived that. They got through it. Bush he left office, and it felt like the slate was wiped clean. Do you think we'll see that kind of scenario again?
I think, one of the ironies here is that the U.S. and European view about what was the problem with Iran is essentially the same problems, actually. Nuclear, nature of the regime, its regional behavior, support for terror. The list looks similar on both sides of the Atlantic. But what do you do about it? And I think, Europe has been particularly troubled by the idea that they would be called upon to support something that they didn't design in terms of the war, and may even now be left with a maritime security mission without the United States being present as well. They have a lot of capability to do maritime security, you know this very well, maritime security operations, but not in very hostile environments. And so you still need the United States and Europe together to do these things. But Europe is just uncomfortable with being part of things that it doesn't have any say in.
Right. And
that's understandable to me.
Alexandru, we only have 2 minutes left. Let me give me your final thoughts on the exchange you've heard here.
So, in terms of how Trump portrays Europe in regards to Iran war, well, Europe is just might be left with a hot potato it never asked for, which is the maritime security situation. It's not just Europe; it's the entire world, and especially the region. And we've seen this happening, but at the same time, we must understand that if the world is not taking necessarily a stance to this teaches the wrong lessons to other actors looking at. Like that geography itself, it's a cul-de-sac type sea. We have this in and around Europe, and we have actors that might want to do a similar maritime insecurity campaign to some form of political extent, because in the end, if you attack ships which are not your flag, what's your reason to be there and to intervene? But you depend on shipping, and it's done on any number of ships, on any number of flags. So this type of diplomatic exchange, a diplomatic, stance that Europe has taken with no bite, it's actually hurting the idea of defense and collective defense overall. And it's kind of looking bad on NATO to some extent. And we see that Iran is portraying this over and over again. We have seen that commentary from Secretary General Rutte in the Oval Office, and instantly after, Iranian media started manipulating that and using as a proof of NATO intervening actively in a conflict where it was actually clearly not the case. Everybody stayed away from this war and left the administration of Trump and Netanyahu to handle it because they started it on their own accord. But yeah, this is the risk. This is the risk because there is this intertwine of politics and defense and relationship, transatlantic bonds that will get pulled whenever one of the allies is doing something that can be considered controversial.
Right. Alexandru, that will unfortunately have to be the final word for this special edition of the Newsmakers. I'd sincerely like to thank all three of you so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.